Yeah, I think the point is I'm a livelihoods advisor working with our humanitarian people, mainly around the protracted crisis and livelihoods agenda, if you like, and trying to think more broadly, more cleverly about how we do our humanitarian responses, but then also trying to bring in the climate change and food security people. This is Halima, who is a widow, who lives just outside of Diradawa, and I class camels as sort of resilience on four legs, and I try to get as many camel photos in the front of our documents as possible, basically. So I want to talk about three things. I want to talk about the overall process of embedding resilience, and this is kind of an internal DFID process, and this came out of our Humanitarian Emergency Response Review, I'll talk to it later, in fact. Then I'll give a Somalia case study. We use the Ethiopia case study a lot, and I thought Somalia brings in that sort of conflict and insecurity and peace-building element, which I think is an area that we're all struggling with. I'm not saying we've got the answers, but... and then something about our multi-year humanitarian programming. Okay, this was from the Lord Ashdown report, and was then sort of flipped over into one of our 4 or 5 policy areas in resilience, in building resilience. And the idea was to go round to all of our country officers, 28 in all, and to look at how to do our own country programming differently, but also having an external look as to how we could then engage with other partners, obviously, because that's what we do on a day-to-day level. So the first 8 countries was kind of the people who were doing stuff already. So we had a really interesting workshop. It was 3 days in Addis where the country officers were actually presenting to us on what they were doing on resilience and where they thought our best sort of traction way in, and then how we in the centre could help to develop that process. We have just been going through a much more complicated number of countries, which is the second bullet, which brings in the complexities of the environment, where you've got climate, insecurity, poor governance. I mean, you name it. Tanzania was the outlier, and they kept on apologising for not having a conflict in their country, but they're obviously focusing on the climate change element of this. So what we started doing, we had to sort of get some sort of baseline in, so we defined some minimum standards, and this is more a process than a sort of quality, and I think we're now starting to look at what's the quality once they've gone through the process. The first step is undertaking a multi-hazard disaster risk assessment, and as I said, we're not being prescriptive, we're building on where the sort of politics, where the energy, where the best way in is. So a multi-hazard disaster risk assessment is kind of the framing document for the country office then to take then to develop its strategy and take that forward. And it isn't rocket science. It's what are the natural and man-made hazards and stresses. So we talk about shocks as well as stresses here. Who and where are the vulnerable? Why? Then we look at sort of capacity and leadership of government, but we also look at the capacity and leadership of the sort of external aid architecture around that as well. And we're starting to look at the sort of same thing around climate. And then we try and sort of develop different scenarios to look at economic, social, political impacts. And then finally we look at, and this is kind of the step on from the multi-hazard risk assessment, what is DFID doing on disaster resilience? What should it do more of? I don't want to go into the programs, but I want to go into the sort of promising practices, and there's a kind of a list there which I won't run right the way through, but I'll pick out a few. We've just gone through a policy refresh, and we're having 2 things that are being raised further for us. The first one is resilience. We are continuing with this. We do feel this is important, but also cash transfers in the humanitarian sector. So we are looking at social transfer programs. Anybody went to the PSMP knows what I'm talking about. And we are going to give a bigger push about where the context is right and where the markets are working, stop doing food aid. Then the early warning, but I think very much linked to the early interventions, and I think that was learning that came out of the 2011 emergency, that all the lights were changing green, orange, red, and then people were still stumbling as to when to go in. Multi-year programming I'm going to talk to. Under that, there is the peace-building stabilisation practices in programmes in fragile and conflict-affected states. And this isn't something we're doing at the moment. I think there is good practice spotted around, but it's something that we are going to try and get, we're going to try and almost formalise and do more of. So that's more an aspiration. Anticipation came out of the HER as well. We know where it's going to happen. And then very much on the development side, market interventions, strengthening markets. I now want to talk a bit about embedding in DFID Somalia. And after the multi-hazard risk assessment, I was working with the country office on how we could take this forward. And they've got a sort of objectives, principles list. There are 10 of them, but I've just pulled out 5 to talk to. That once we've done the multi-hazard risk assessment, it's very much for the office to lead on that and for us to give advice from the centre or other consultancies or whatever. But we act very, very much as a facilitation and technical support if needed. So five of theirs, they're up there. Strengthen subnational conflict management, and this is very much coming out of our stabilisation programme, our governance and peace-building programmes, who are at one end of the office, and at the other end of the office are our new approaches to humanitarian assistance. And we've got quite a lot of buy-in that these guys are going to work together so we can do humanitarian assistance in much more of a sort of way that can do peace building and stabilisation. Nutrition and health services, I think there's quite a clear story, and I think we do have more clarity about resilience on nutrition from sort of acute to stunting, through to overnutrition. And I think that we are trying to link those up from the humanitarian up, which will come out in the slide. Scale up economic development, and this is kind of the slightly bigger push because there are kind of 3 Somalias, Somaliland, Puntland, South and Central. And the lesson learning from Somaliland we're trying to push down to Puntland, and the lesson learning from Puntland we're trying to put into South Central. And then something which we've started investing a lot of funding on in a lot of these programs is much more built up, robust M&E. And it's not just M&E, it's sort of real-time, sort of feedback loops. So you're learning as you're doing these 3-year programs, and you're adjusting the programs as you're either doing the wrong thing or the context changes. And again, we haven't got that right yet, but we're rolling out a lot of programs, so we've got to start. Okay, a conceptualization of how we're going to sort of put all this together. This is a sort of, poverty line, different poverty lines for probably rural Somalia, I would say. At the top is the World Bank poverty line, national poverty line. Then you've got sort of, 2 categories under the sort of, food insecure. One are stressed, one are rocking in and out of crisis. And then at the bottom, you've got your severe risk and emergencies. So here the concept is that there's a sort of seasonality to the poverty, and the seasonality is around weather, and it's also around conflict and displacement. So people aren't either wealthy or poor. There's a sort of a churning, and that's kind of a challenge to us, if you like. So we have stresses and shocks, which are kind of have an effect of pulling these people down these poverty lines. So our governance and peace-building programme is very much working alongside, what there is of government, and it really is, sort of trying to hit all the different layers. We have our Humanitarian Preparedness and Response at the bottom, which is kind of, there for when. So all of our resilience thinking, it's still about life-saving if that's what's needed. That's not a discussion. We go in with a fire engine if it's really needed. Then we have our health and nutrition programme, and part of the nutrition programme is actually in the humanitarian, more the resilient side of our multi-year humanitarian funding, and we're funding an NGO consortium led by SAVE on that. Then within the health programme, which is much more of a sort of capacity building of government programme, we are trying to make those linkages into their nutrition programming and building that up. In the middle, we have our internal risk finance, which is kind of the crisis modifier that Greg was talking to. Right, okay, I'm going to run out of time. And then we have wealth creation, which is sucking people out, if you like. And then resilient livelihoods, again, is trying to affect all these different layers. And the concept is, the yellow arrow, is this building resilience? That's where we're trying to get to. So very quickly on multi-year humanitarian programs. We had a development economist in to do a value for money study, and the kind of outputs from that were the potential for lower operational costs, flexibility for early response, and predictability. So you know the finances are there, so you can look in the longer term if you like. We have these developed and being implemented in Somalia, Ethiopia, Kenya, DRC, Sudan and Yemen. And we are finalising one in the Sahel region, which is over 4 years, and one in Pakistan. So this is something that's sort of spreading, and it's not spreading from the top, it's spreading between the country offices. So in Somalia, for example, we have a £145 million programme over 4 years, and within that we've got our risk financing component of 40 million. They're usually about 20% of the total budget. And this is, within the multi-year programmes, we've got our humanitarian programmes, which is the saving life where necessary. We are trying to hit the chronically vulnerable with our resilience enhancing programmes, influencing and promoting change within the humanitarian system in Nairobi, if you like. And then we have this sort of new and innovative M&E, which I talked about before. What we're funding the 3 UNs, which I'm sure people are aware of. This is FAO, UNICEF, WFP, and then we're funding 2 consortiums, one which is doing more the resilience part of the programme, one which is talking to the nutrition part of the programme, and we're also doing some UNHCR managed returns consortium, and we've got our M&E unit that I mentioned. And then the IRF, which is our crisis modifier effect, if you like. Its 3 main funding streams is preventative early action, emergency rapid response, and for the Somalia context, refugee returns. But again, the office itself decides what's in and what's out. It promotes the early pre-emergency and no regrets actions, so we can get in earlier. The signing off is by the country office, not by London. And we are developing early action triggers, which is to be agreed across our partners. And that is linked to a set of recommended actions projects. And it's budgeted at 10 million a year, but if there's a big one, we can actually go in with more depending. So it's got a flexibility even within that, if you like. Just to move to another context, this is Bangladesh. And this is just to say, just because you've got a flood doesn't mean it has to be an emergency.